Okay, guys, so today we're going to start taking a look at the JFK and LBJ presidencies. JFK obviously stands for John F. Kennedy, and LBJ stands for Lyndon Baines Johnson. So these two had back-to-back presidencies. We'll go over a lot of the important details, and obviously you guys probably know about JFK was assassinated during his presidency, and then LBJ would take over. So these are just a few of our goals for this unit. So as you guys can see, it says we will identify significant terms pertaining to the presidencies of LBJ and JFK. We will analyze some of the causes and effects of their decisions and actions, and we will form an opinion on the JFK assassination and whether the official findings were accurate in your opinion. So JFK, I think I mentioned this before, but a lot of times presidents will give they used to give their presidencies like a name. Again, I mean, you don't really hear this too much anymore, but JFK called his presidency the New Frontier, and a lot of that had to do with his goals with space, which we'll talk about here in a second. But, JFK saw space as like our next important objective, and he was the one that set the goal to go to the moon. He actually was killed before we made it to the moon, and but then LBJ, he called his presidency the Great Society because, again, that was his vision for the country. He was going to create, what he called a great society, and, we'll discuss the details of what that entailed, but he essentially thought that he was going to be able to create, somewhat of a utopian society here in the United States during his presidency, and unfortunately for him, that never transpired because probably the biggest reason was Vietnam. And obviously Vietnam's going to be its own unit. We'll talk about that later. We'll touch upon it here a little bit, but, it really sort of consumed Johnson's presidency, the Vietnam War, because it was, it started right at the beginning of his presidency, and it wouldn't end until after he was president. So with that being said, the 1960 campaign, so Republicans nominated in 1960 Richard Nixon. Obviously, you guys have probably heard that name before. He was the vice president under Eisenhower. Henry Cabot Lodge was chosen as his running mate. The Democrats nominated John F. Kennedy, senator from Massachusetts. The Democrats tried their luck once again with a Catholic candidate. Lyndon B. Johnson was his running mate. And again, I'll talk about this a little more in a second, but it was kind of a big deal that he was a Catholic. I'll circle back to that in a minute, but this was the first time in which presidential debates were televised as well as on the radio. So TV was a relatively new invention at the time. It came about in the 1950s, so we're in 1960 here. They had a televised version of the debate, and then they also had it on the radio, just audio, obviously. But like it says here, confident, young, relaxed Kennedy won the television, and nervous, old, achy Nixon won the radio. So when they surveyed people who watched the debates on TV, they, the majority said that they thought Kennedy won the debate, but the people that listened to it on the radio thought that Nixon won the debate. So it's kind of interesting that between the visual and audio, people had different opinions on who they thought came out on top of that. And again, Kennedy was kind of seen as like a handsome young guy, and Nixon was like the older candidate. So some people think maybe that played a role, just that Kennedy was, I guess, better looking, and that affected people's opinions of the outcome of the debate. So kind of interesting there, but regardless, they billed it as the fight of the year. So kind of like a boxing match or a fight, between these two guys. This video is out there. We might take a look at it, but it's on YouTube. But Kennedy seemed a little more in tune with the new technology, better prepared. A lot of historians will point out things like the contrast of Kennedy's suit, who wore a darker suit, as opposed to Nixon, who wore sort of a lighter suit that blended it. He didn't contrast the background as much and stuff like that. So Nixon was also running a fever. He had some sort of infection, so he didn't feel well that night. Things of that nature. There's actually a lot of things about this debate that were interesting, but like I said, this is actually on YouTube.
Good evening.
Maybe we'll take a look at this later, but I'm going to keep going. So, and then I kind of embedded a few questions throughout these notes just to kind of get you guys thinking a little bit. But this question obviously says, in your opinion, does technology have a lesser or greater impact on the outcome of elections today? And I said, why do you feel that way? So I'll let you think about that. So the results, Kennedy defeated Nixon by fewer than 120,000 votes, which is actually a pretty narrow margin of victory. The electoral votes for Kennedy were 303 and Nixon 219. At the age of 43, JFK became the youngest elected president. Okay, now notice it says youngest elected president, not the youngest president. That's kind of an interesting trivia question because the youngest person to ever serve as president was Teddy Roosevelt. He became president at the age of 42 when McKinley got assassinated, but JFK was the youngest elected president. And I'm sure that you all know that in order to be the president, you have to be 35 years of age. So, but the youngest ever was 42, and then, like I said, JFK was 43 when he was elected. So, that being said, here's your electoral map. Shows you the outcome. Kennedy was red. Nixon was blue. Another interesting thing I want to point out real quick is that, Kennedy was Northerner. He was a Yankee, as they would call him in the South. And a lot of times when presidential candidates are selecting their running mates, they choose somebody that's strategically the right pick. Most times the president and vice president are not friends. They're not old buddies from high school or college. I mean, people get confused about that. It's like, when you look at Joe Biden, he was the vice president under Obama. They probably didn't know each other prior to serving as president and vice president. Trump had Mike Pence is his vice president. They didn't know each other either. But there's political strategists that figure out who the right person to try to run with in order to get more votes. And so if you look here, Kennedy won a lot of the South. And the reason for that is because he brought on Lyndon Baines Johnson as his running mate, and Johnson was a Southerner. He was from Texas. So, it's just kind of interesting how they kind of figure out who they should choose to serve as their vice president, stuff like that. So, in your opinion, what is the ideal age for a president and why? So, like I said, you only need to be 35, but nobody's ever been that young. 42 is the youngest ever. Most presidents obviously are older. Biden is the oldest person to ever serve, and obviously we hear about some of the criticism there that maybe he's too old, and Trump's not a kid either. Trump's, I think, late 70s. So, but even like Hillary Clinton, President Obama is relatively young. I'm trying to think. I believe he was 48 when he got elected, so that was pretty young. But, a lot of times politicians tend to be a little bit older. So there's pros and cons, I guess, to young versus old. But so the Kennedy White House, let's take a look at this. So his statistics, like I said, he was the youngest ever elected at 43. Marital status, married for 8 years to Jacqueline Bouvier. Religion was Catholic, and I mentioned that a second ago. And, today, if somebody's a Catholic, which I believe Joe Biden's a Catholic, people this issue doesn't really get brought up a whole lot. But you have to remember something that, back in 1960, being a Catholic was kind of a big deal because people were afraid that the president, if he was a Catholic, he may be more loyal to the Pope, that the Pope's kind of the head of the Catholic Church. People felt that the president would be more loyal possibly to the Pope than to the United States, and the Pope could sort of dictate what he did as the president. And so that's why that was somewhat of a concern. Like I said, you really don't hear the topic of religion brought up too much anymore. The Republicans had a guy who was running, Vivek Ramaswamy. He's Hindu, and so it didn't seem like that was a major issue in people's opinions anymore. So I don't know, but it was a big deal because Kennedy was the first Catholic president, so that was kind of like made a big deal. But regardless, 4 children, 2 sons, 2 daughters. Political party, obviously Democrat. Education, Harvard, very prestigious. And also, he was a career U.S. Navy veteran. He won the Purple Heart, which was a big deal. He was a Pulitzer Prize winner, which is a pretty distinguished honor. Massachusetts Senator, House of Representatives member. And then, like I said a second ago, I just sort of threw this out there so that you guys could think about it. But, what is your opinion on whether or not we should care about the president's religion? So I'll let you guys think about that. So the Kennedy charisma. Kennedy brought to the White House a renewed sense of charisma, which lacked under President Eisenhower. So again, talking about the age thing, President Eisenhower is pretty old. So this contrasted him a lot because now you're bringing in a really young guy after a really old guy. And, obviously that's appealing to certain people, especially younger people, because, even if you think of yourselves, it's like, if you could have let's just say it's your boss, and your boss is maybe in their 40s as opposed to somebody that's as old as your grandparents. A lot of times younger people are going to gravitate more towards the younger person because they're going to kind of understand them a little more. So that was more appealing to the younger people. But he was a graduate of Harvard, had a magnetic personality, very athletic, and handsome to the ladies, I suppose. He was known for that. And so oftentimes historians would refer to the Kennedy family as Camelot. If you're not familiar with what Camelot refers to, it's basically the Knights of the Round Table. Most of you have probably heard of King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table from, mythology. But that's kind of how the Kennedys were viewed, was like this, because a lot of them, they were powerful and they were politicians and things like that. So somewhat similar to, Knights of the Round Table, I suppose. But the first family, Jackie Kennedy, was well admired throughout the world. The Kennedy children, Arabella, Patrick, Carolyn, and John Jr. were the kids. Unfortunately, only 2 out of the 4 survived, and I will circle back to that here in a second. But that's John Jr. playing in the Oval Office. And then it says here, in your opinion, is it important for the president to portray the image of a family man? Why or why not? Which Kennedy tried to do. A lot of times there was pictures with his kids and things like that. So again, I don't know if that matters to people, whether they're family oriented. There's only ever been one president who was not married, and that was Buchanan. So most of the presidents have been married, but it's very ironic because JFK tried to portray himself as a family man, but it was well known that he had an affair with Marilyn Monroe, and it wasn't just John F. Kennedy, but also his brother Bobby Kennedy also had an affair with Marilyn Monroe. So there was a famous rendition of Marilyn Monroe singing
Marilyn Monroe,
Happy Birthday to JFK.
Mr. President, the late Marilyn Monroe.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Mr. President. Happy birthday to you.
So, it's kind of ironic that the guy that introduced Marilyn Monroe said the late Marilyn Monroe, because shortly thereafter she actually would die. And there is a conspiracy attached to this. That it was ruled a suicide, but there's a lot of red flags that go up about the autopsy and some of the things that, were involved, because she was on the phone with the Kennedys an hour or two before she was found dead and things like that. So there's a lot of suspicion that she may have been murdered, and so again, that conspiracy is still out there today. Okay, and so Kennedy's effect on the youth throughout America found Kennedy inspiring, like I had mentioned a second ago. Just because he was a younger guy, I think young people felt like he was more relatable. Donna Shalala, who was a future congresswoman, stated that she, under Kennedy, let me just clarify what this Peace Corps thing is. Kennedy realized not everybody wanted to serve in the military, but he issued a famous quote where he said, "Ask not what your country can do for you, but ask what you can do for your country." Maybe you guys have heard that, but I think it was a great question because he's kind of saying, like, everybody's always looking for what they can get from the country, benefits or, whatever it is. But he's saying, like, ask what you can do to give back. But he also realized that not everybody wanted to serve in the military, which is maybe what people would think when they're saying like serve your country. So he actually helped create the Peace Corps, and the Peace Corps, as opposed to the Marine Corps, was obviously an organization that will go around the world. Like it says here, they help to inspire and spread American principles throughout the world, like democracy and things like that. And so this lady, Donna Shalala, said that when she heard Kennedy say that quote, it really inspired her, and a lot of young people felt the same way. They were very inspired by Kennedy's words and almost like his challenge to say, like, what can you do for your country? And that really created a lot of involvement, and young people wanted to get involved, because the president kind of asked them to. And she had said, that nobody had ever asked her to do anything before. She felt like young people were kind of left out of the picture, and they weren't really expected to participate in, doing things for their country or in honor of their country. And so she felt very inspired by that. And down here in this picture on the right, this is actually a pretty famous future politician. I don't know if you guys recognize this young man right here shaking hands with the president, but that is, let me see here, future President Bill Clinton. And so kind of ironic again, because these two were sort of a similar personality. Clinton was known for being charming, and he was a younger guy. I want to say he might have been late 40s, early 50s when he was elected, so he was a younger guy for the president. And he was also known for his philandering ways. And if you don't know what philandering means, I'll let you Google that. Kennedy advisors. Kennedy surrounded himself with others who shared his ideals. Cabinet members' average age was 47, so again, very young, in regards to politics. But they were very well educated, considered the best and the brightest, but not politically experienced because they were so young. The Attorney General was Robert Bobby Kennedy, who was the president's closest advisor and brother. And, throughout JFK's presidency, Bobby Kennedy would always be at his side. And Bobby Kennedy was the guy that he would confide in, and when he was looking for advice and things of that nature. And believe it or not, this kind of ties in with JFK's relationship with his vice president, Lyndon Johnson. And, Johnson, again, I might circle back to this, but he was known for being very arrogant, very power hungry. And so when Kennedy sort of like overlooked Johnson as an advisor and went to his brother Bobby, Johnson was offended by that because he felt like he was being left out of important decisions and important information. So, again, fast forwarding to the assassination that JFK will kill JFK, a lot of people believe that Johnson was involved because Johnson didn't like the Kennedys. And I actually read a book about JFK a few years back and his assassination, and there was actually an interesting story in there, which was, Bobby Kennedy, when he and Johnson first met, they were playing golf together. That was sort of their introduction, was to go play a round of golf. And the book said that after they played golf together, Johnson and Kennedy, they hated each other ever since that. So, again, kind of interesting, that, like I said, that kind of, some people feel like maybe that was a part of this whole assassination plot, whatever, but we don't know. We'll talk more about that later. So presidential advisors, and another question out here, threw out there for you guys, which is, if you were president of the United States, what 3 people would be your closest advisors and why? So again, you probably never really thought about this, but if you were going to be the president or you were going to run a company, who would you trust to be your closest advisors? Because obviously you're going to want to have people next to you that you feel are capable and also that you have full trust in, because it's an important job. And this brings us to the Kennedy curse. So like it says here, there's a lot of people who believe that the Kennedy family was cursed, and there's just a number of examples as to why. And I'll kind of try to move through this kind of quick, but in 1941, Rosemary Kennedy, which was JFK's sister, she had a lot of mental illness. And like it says here, her father, Joseph Kennedy Sr., I should say, arranged in secret for her to undergo a lobotomy. And so if you guys aren't sure what a lobotomy, or you've never heard of a lobotomy, it was a medical procedure that they did in the 1950s, I believe was the majority. And I mean, they did tens, maybe hundreds of thousands of these. It's crazy. I watched a documentary on this. And what they would do is they would jam an ice pick into the person's skull behind their eye. So they would, while they were alive, I think they sedated them. But anyways, they would take the ice pick and move it back and forth like a windshield wiper, and it would dislodge the prefrontal cortex from their skull, and it basically rendered them just, for lack of a better word, I guess a vegetable is what they used to call people. They would just sit there and stare out the window. So, this was seen as a better way to deal with people who were severely mentally handicapped because they could get violent and things like that. And so, kind of crazy, but August 12th, 1944, Joseph P. Kennedy Jr., so JFK's oldest brother, was killed in action while flying a mission during World War II over England. So he died. May 13th, 1948, Kathleen Cavendish, who was related to the Kennedys, was killed in a plane crash. This brings us to August 23rd, 1956. Jackie Kennedy gives birth to a stillborn daughter, Arabella. So Kennedys lost their daughter there. August 9th, Patrick Bouvier Kennedy was born 6 weeks premature and dies 2 days later after his birth. So the Kennedys lost their first two kids. November 22nd, 1963. Obviously, this is the day that Lee Harvey Oswald would shoot Kennedy. Take a closer look at that later. June 19th, 1964, U.S. Senator Ted Kennedy is involved in a plane crash. One of his aides and the pilot were killed. He's pulled out of the wreckage, but he's pretty beat up. June 6, 1968, U.S. Senator Bobby Kennedy, so JFK's brother, was also assassinated a few years after JFK was killed. July 18th, 1969, a car driven by Ted Kennedy goes off a bridge, drowned his passenger. August 13, 1973, Joseph P. Kennedy II is the driver in a car accident, leaves one passenger paralyzed. November 17, 1973, Edward M. Kennedy Jr. loses a portion of his right leg due to bone cancer. April 25th, 1984, David Anthony Kennedy dies from a Demerol and cocaine overdose. December 31st, 1997, Michael Lemoyne Kennedy is killed in a skiing accident. July 16th, 1999, JFK Jr., so JFK's son, was killed in a plane crash. I do remember that. August 25th, 2009, Ted Kennedy, the last remaining brother, dies of brain cancer. So I said, is the Kennedy family cursed? I don't know. Obviously, they've suffered a lot of tragedy. I'll leave that up to you guys to decide. Okay, and so the domestic frontier, new frontier regarding managing the economy, how JFK's administration managed the economy. C. Douglas DeLeon was the Republican under Eisenhower, who was the Secretary of Treasury. He stayed on. Like it says here, in dealing with economic matters of the era, there was rising unemployment and inflation. Kennedy called for an increase in government spending to stimulate the economy. And this is something that a number of presidents have tried throughout history. When the economy is struggling, they'll try and increase government spending, try and generate economic activity by putting money into the economy. Again, I think I've said this before, but economics is kind of a theoretical, science. It's not, there's no exact, like, this works, this doesn't. So a lot of times it's kind of like what you think is going to work. It's kind of opinion based. And so, like it says here, Kennedy tried to settle differences between management and workers. He wanted management to lower prices and workers to basically ask for less pay increases. U.S. Steel Roger Blau announced high prices, and President Kennedy attacked the steel companies because of that. So, again, you guys don't need to know the details about all the economy and things of that nature. Obviously we're covering it, but for the most part, as long as you kind of generally know what a lot of this stuff is dealing with, that's good enough. I'll give you guys a study guide before the quiz so you'll know exactly what you need to know, but, don't worry too much about like the details of the economics because, again, that can get kind of complicated. So Kennedy and the Congress. Kennedy received little cooperation with his domestic agenda from Congress because Kennedy was a Democrat and the Congress was being controlled by the Republicans. And again, you guys, if you pay attention to politics at all, this is kind of like an ongoing trend. A lot of times if you have a Republican president and a Democratic Congress, they butt heads, and same thing. Democratic president with a Republican Congress, it's a similar situation. So Kennedy also, after much reluctance, imposed a tax cut by some $10 billion. Critics complained that he couldn't cut taxes and increase government spending at the same time, so Congress failed to pass that proposal. And again, it really doesn't make sense to try and increase government spending while cutting taxes because, as you guys know, the money that is spent by the government is collected through taxes. So if you cut taxes, you're not going to have as much money to spend, and that's kind of what the critics were saying here. So JFK sets the goal to put a man on the moon. Let's see how long this is.
But
2
why,
minutes.
some say, the moon? Why choose this as our goal? And they may well ask, why climb the highest mountain? Why, 35 years ago, fly the Atlantic? Why does Rice play Texas? We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we're willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one we intend to win, and the others too. We shall send to the moon 240,000 miles away from the control station in Houston, a giant rocket more than 300 feet tall, the length of this football field, made of new metal alloys, some of which have not yet been invented, capable of standing heat and stresses several times more than have ever been experienced, fitted together with a precision better than the finest watch, carrying all the equipment needed for propulsion, guidance, control, communications, food, and survival on an untried mission to an unknown celestial body, and then return it safely to Earth, re-entering the atmosphere at speeds of over 25,000 miles per hour, causing heat about half that on the temperature of the sun, almost as hot as it is here today, and do all this, and do all this, and do it right, and do it first before this decade is out, then we must be bold.
All right, so as you can see there, I mean, Kennedy kind of lays out his vision, I guess, for putting a man on the moon. Sounds like a pretty impossible task. But, you know, one thing that we have to keep in mind is that this whole goal to put a man on the moon was a big part of it was trying to conquer the Soviets, because the Soviets had already put a satellite into space. So now we're trying to kind of pass them in this space race and be the first country to put a man on the moon. So, you know, whether or not that really happened, there's a conspiracy there, but we don't need to get into it right now. So that's why the Space Center is named the Kennedy Space Center down in Florida. So, like it says here, what do you think? In your opinion, should the U.S. continue to pursue space exploration? Why or why not? Again, this is just something to get you thinking, but it's just extremely expensive. You know, NASA's, I can't remember what NASA's budget is, but it's, you know, billions, probably hundreds of billions. So it's just a lot of money. Helping the disadvantaged. So Area Redevelopment Act passed by Congress provided financial assistance to economically distressed regions. Michael Harrington wrote a book called The Other America. It was a study of poverty in America. 42 million Americans lived on less than $1,000 per year. So, you know, there was a lot of emphasis on trying to help, you know, the people that were living in poverty, help lift them up and at least get them to a decent standard of living. And this was kind of started during the Kennedy administration, but we'll talk about it here in a minute. But LBJ Johnson, President Johnson, he really, you know, did a lot in that area as far as like helping the poor and impoverished people to, you know, improve their, like I said, standard of living. But these are just some pictures from, I believe this is down in Appalachia, where there's a lot of coal mining. And there still is a lot of coal mining down there to this day, believe it or not, in places like West Virginia. But you can see here these houses that people were living in. You know, they were pretty bad. I'll show you some more pictures here a little bit later. But Kennedy's foreign policy. So Kennedy's policies on dealing with other countries and foreign affairs. President Kennedy tended to follow the Cold War policies of previous presidents. However, he did seek out other methods to block communist expansion beside nuclear weapons. So Kennedy kind of changed the strategy on dealing with, you know, pretty much the Soviet Union. And the strategy was no longer going to be an all-out war. Because as we had discussed in previous units, the philosophy was that now that there were nuclear weapons in the world, and both the Soviets and the U.S. had nuclear weapons, that if we did go to war and it did turn to nuclear weapons, we would just annihilate the entire global population. So Kennedy said, we can't fight that kind of war, so we got to figure out different strategies on how to fight, the Soviets and our foreign enemies without turning to the nuke. And so this is where this idea of flexible response came from. And flexible response responds to creating a number of options in case of international crisis other than nukes. And like it says here, he planned on strengthening conventional military forces, but also establish special forces units like the Green Berets. So this is where we see the emergence of special forces. And, any of you guys out there that, play video games and, or watch movies on, military stuff, this is where kind of like the Green Berets and the Navy SEALs and, just those types of special forces units, Delta Force. That's when all these different, units were created. So JFK establishes the Navy SEALs, aware of the need for covert operations in Southeast Asia, specifically Vietnam. This is when Vietnam was starting to pick up. It wasn't a war yet. We weren't completely involved in this yet, but it was starting to heat up in Vietnam, and Kennedy knew that, so he gave a speech to Congress on May 25th, 1961, to announce plans to spend $100 million on developing the SEALs. SEAL stands for Sea, Air, and Land, so it's an acronym, obviously. I think I've said this before. The military loves acronyms. But they would work in small units of 10 to 20 men, all male. Just recently, Congress did change this rule to where women can now serve in every branch of the military that men serve in. So women can now be fighter pilots and women can serve in special forces units. But up until this point, no women have made it through the training. I believe maybe a couple have tried. But, like it says here, it's the training is excruciating, probably the toughest training in the world, best soldiers in the world. The dropout rate for the Navy SEALs is 80%, and you actually have to pass a test just to get into the training. When I was in the Air Force, I had a buddy who was he was Air Force Special Forces, and he had actually dropped out. But I remember he had to pass, various tests just to get into the actual training. And, it's a pretty tough test just to get into it. And then out of all the people that get through that initial training into the training program, into the SEALs or, any other branch of special forces, it's like the dropout rate's then 80%, so almost nobody makes it through. But like it says here, training can take up to 30 months because it's not just physical training, but that, if you get through the initial part of special forces training, like with the SEALs, they then will send you to demolition school or, jump school where you're jumping out of airplanes, and there's all these specialty trainings that they also put these guys through once they get through the initial part of the training. So that's why it takes so long. And I heard the government spends $1 million for one person to train. So I'd pose another question here. It says, what do you think? Why did JFK feel that it was important to develop these smaller, highly trained units of military personnel? And I know I just talked about that, but it was more of using sort of this, pinpoint accuracy in dealing with foreign threats rather than throwing, conventional military forces in a full-out war or nukes. And, I guess the mentality was that we would save lives because you're not going to be killing as many people on the battlefield. That's the trident that the SEALs get if they successfully complete training. These are just some pictures of the Navy SEALs training, but they do a lot of stuff in the water, obviously. This is a big part of it. When I was stationed in California, I was actually at the base where the Navy SEALs were training. And, I didn't see them there because they kind of keep them secluded. But, it's right on the beach, as you can see here. I mean, it's right on the coast of California, so it's Pacific Ocean, and they do a lot of this stuff. They try to keep them cold, wet, and miserable, as they say. You guys know, when you're cold and wet, or sometimes maybe you've been swimming or something, you get out of the pool, it's like, and it's cold or it's not very warm out. It's pretty miserable, and that's what they do to these guys the whole time. And not just that, but as you can see, they're wearing full military gear. And again, you guys go to the beach, it's like, how it is with sand. You get sand in your shoes and your shorts, whatever. It's really annoying, and it actually hurts a little bit. They do a lot of this stuff with these giant logs, basically like telephone poles. And the point of that is to try and create an ability to work cooperatively with a team. It's not about the individual. And again, they really emphasize this. This isn't about the individual. It's not about you. So it's not personal glory. This is about the success of the team. And so that's what this is all about. And that's what they really emphasize throughout all this training. This is called drown proofing. And it's pretty much what it looks like. They tie your hands, behind your back. They tie your feet. They make you jump in the deep end of the pool. And this is basically what you have to do. Bob for 5 minutes, float for 5 minutes, swim 100 meters with your hands and feet tied. Bob for 2 more minutes, do some forward-backward flips, swim to the bottom of the pool and retrieve an object with their teeth, return to the surface and bob 5 more times. So it's pretty crazy. But they're trying to teach guys how to survive if you do get tied up and end up in the water somehow. There have been some people that have died doing this, believe it or not. So obviously very dangerous, but it does happen. There's been a bunch of movies made starring Navy SEALs. Lone Survivor was a book that was turned into a movie. I've actually read the book. It's pretty good. American Sniper, that's a big one. I read that book as well. Captain Phillips is about a true story where a cargo ship got hijacked by pirates and the Navy SEALs had to come in and rescue the ship. There was a documentary back in the day, I think it was in the 70s, called Men with Green Faces. It's on YouTube. Just kind of documentary on the Navy SEALs. Your discretion is advised with this picture. The Navy SEALs were the ones that killed bin Laden. I don't know if that's a real photo or not, but...
U.S. Special Operations Forces, which includes elite commando forces from each branch of the military, such as the Navy SEALs, Army Rangers, and others, have become critical to many U.S. military successes over the past decade. Each branch of the military has its own specially trained teams that can operate in any situation and perform whatever task it takes to get the job done.
Okay, and this brings us to foreign aid. Foreign aid means the money that we're giving to other countries. So Kennedy sponsored aid programs to help countries in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. The Peace Corps I mentioned a little bit ago. American volunteers would go to work for 2 years in developing countries. So again, it was sort of a way for people to get involved in helping out the world without joining the military. So you're still serving your country, but you're not doing it through the military because some people, don't want to be put in those positions. So the Peace Corps was developed as an alternative to that. So Alliance for Progress, billions in aid to Latin America. If these countries began democratic reform and encouraged capitalism, it wasn't very successful because of lack of money and corrupt politicians in Latin America. So essentially the U.S. developed this Alliance for Progress program in order to try to help other countries, like it says, develop a similar government and economic system as the United States. We think democracy and capitalism are the best ways to run a country. And so we wanted these other countries to kind of follow our lead. But like it says here, a lot of times the U.S. does this. I mean, we've done this many, many times. I don't even know, dozens. And we still do it. But, just like a recent example is Iraq, the Middle East. Obviously, we've been over there, involved in a lot of wars over there, and a lot of times the U.S. will give money to these countries to try and help them, kind of rebuild and again, kind of, create their own democratic governments. But there's corruption. There's a lot of corruption, political corruption. So we send this money over there and, it just gets stolen basically. And let's keep in mind, that's taxpayer dollars, U.S. taxpayer dollars. That money's not coming out of thin air. And so this just kind of raises another question I want you guys to think about. So it says in 2020, the U.S. provided approximately $51 billion in foreign aid to countries in need. In your opinion, should the U.S. continue with this type of assistance? Why or why not? So, a recent example that comes to mind is the Ukraine. So, the Ukraine's been in the news a lot. Russia invaded the Ukraine. There's a war going on. And the U.S. is kind of split on whether or not we should be supporting that conflict. We really don't have any interest in it. The Ukraine, they're not a part of NATO, which is our alliance that we're in, and they're not a part of that. So a lot of people are saying, why are we giving money to the Ukraine? And a lot of that money is, people feel like it is still being stolen, through political corruption and things like that. So I think we've given close to $100 billion to the Ukraine so far. And again, it's taxpayer dollars. I was watching a video, kind of like a news reporter today talking about like the U.S. is giving all this money to Ukraine, but meanwhile we have people here in our own country who can't afford groceries and can't afford electricity or a house, or there's a crisis at the border where some people feel there should be a better security at the border to make sure there's not criminals or drug dealers or drug smugglers or human trafficking taking place at the southern border. And so a lot of people feel like we need to use this money for ourselves. There's people here that need it, so we're shipping it overseas, and it's just a kind of a controversial topic. But like I said, we've been doing this for decades. As long as we've been a country. So this brings us to the Bay of Pigs invasion. So there was a Soviet stronghold in Cuba. Fidel Castro was the leader of Cuba, the communist leader. He overthrew the Cuban dictator and established a communist-style dictatorship with ties to the Soviet Union. So even though he was in the Western Hemisphere, right off our southern border, Cuba's, I'll show you a map here in a second, but Cuba's 90 miles off the coast of Florida. So it's really close to the United States. And in this situation, the Cubans had become allies with the Soviets. So this was something that concerned the U.S. because here we're fighting this Cold War against communism in the Soviet Union, and now we have this communist country right next to our own country. And so, obviously that was something that we needed to address. So President Kennedy supported an invasion, which was planned by the CIA to help rebels of Cuba to overthrow Castro, but it failed miserably. At the last minute, Kennedy called off airstrikes. So again, the CIA, we talked about them quite a bit in the last unit, and the CIA, they've done a number of overthrows of governments throughout the world. And again, this is kind of one of the reasons why some other countries don't like the United States, because we go in and sort of oust their leader because we don't like them, and then we put somebody that we want in there, and it's just probably not the right thing to do. You should let countries run themselves. And so the U.S. has done this, specifically the CIA. And so this was kind of another one of those situations. We were going to oust Fidel Castro, but we weren't able to. They tried to assassinate him a number of times. This is a long story. The CIA worked with the mafia. The mafia was going to try to assassinate him. They actually did try, just a bunch of different times. And like it says here, Cuban military forces crushed the rebellion within 72 hours and took 1,200 rebels hostage. So the overthrow failed. The U.S.-supported overthrow failed. And what it means here, where it says Kennedy called off airstrikes, the CIA wanted Kennedy to call in Air Force, bombers and help try to basically defeat this Cuban enemy. And Kennedy said no, because he didn't want to risk going into like an all-out war, because he's thinking if we send in the Air Force, next thing you know, the Soviets now are, they're going to try to get involved, and this could lead to World War III. So like it says here, the Bay of Pigs invasion failed and led to the Cubans becoming even closer to the Soviet Union. So it strengthened their alliance. The reason it was called the Bay of Pigs invasion is, I'll show you a map here in a second, but it was literally took place at, a location called the Bay of Pigs. So here you can see on the coast, here's the Bay of Pigs. Here's Florida. So Florida's up here, 90 miles off the coast. Cuba's 90 miles off the coast of Florida. There's a lot of Cubans, Cuban Americans in Florida, because they're looking for a better life, so they come here and, become U.S. citizens. So, but as you can see, this is where the invasion took place. It failed. Now it's a huge, it was kind of like an embarrassment to the United States. And not only that, but it also created a lot of, what's the word I want to say? Probably tension or conflict between our own government, the CIA and the president. And so I'll elaborate a bit more on that here in a second. But it's just a picture of the attempted overthrow. These are the prisoners, the rebels that were taken prisoner after they were unable to beat Castro and his military. So it says here, failure at the Bay of Pigs results in tension, like I said a minute ago, between JFK and the CIA. So there's books written on this and stuff like that. But this is where the whole JFK assassination conspiracy, kind of comes into play. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later. But like it says here, the CIA was the CIA involved in a coup d'etat. A coup d'etat it's basically a French word, but it basically means a sudden, violent, and unlawful seizure of power from a government. They call it a coup. And this has happened before. You think like, well, our government wouldn't overthrow its own leadership. Like, that just doesn't make sense. But what happened was, after Kennedy refused to send in the Air Force, it led to the failure of the overthrow. And the CIA then got mad at Kennedy, and Kennedy got mad at the CIA for making them look bad. And so that's one of the reasons why a lot of people think the CIA was involved in Kennedy's assassination. This is Castro. Thanks for Playa Giron. Before the invasion, the revolution was weak. Now it's stronger than ever. So he's basically saying you guys just strengthened us by failing. I'm just going to keep going here. I mean, this is just a video about all the different ways they tried to kill Castro that didn't work. So the Berlin crisis, tensions between the U.S. and the Soviet Union intensified over the West and East Berlin. And if you guys recall, a unit or two ago, we talked about how Germany was divided, and then also the capital city of Germany, which was Berlin, was also divided up by the victorious allies of World War II. But, like we've talked about before, this caused a lot of tension between the U.S. and its allies and the Soviet Union because they were all trying to control their own sectors and not, allow the other side to interfere with their side. So as a result of this, the Berlin Wall was created. So Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev, who had replaced Stalin by this point, issued an ultimatum. He said West Germany must recognize the sovereignty or independence of communist East Germany and not interfere with what they were trying to do because, basically people were trying to escape to the fun side from the not fun side. And so they said that, the Western allies must remove all troops from West Berlin. And as a result, the Berlin Wall was created. In mid-August, East Germans erected a barbed wire barrier. And so as time would progress, this barbed wire fence would get more and more heavily fortified, and eventually it would become a pretty substantial barrier between the two sides, fully with, a big, thick concrete wall and guard towers, and they brought in the German Shepherd watchdogs, and they would patrol the fortification and make sure that nobody was trying to escape, and things got kind of ugly there. So the missiles of October, to protect Cuba from other invasions, leader Fidel Castro asked the Soviet Union to provide him with aid. So think back to what we talked about a second ago with the Bay of Pigs invasion. Fidel Castro says, let's make sure this doesn't happen again where somebody tries to overthrow me. So he asked the Soviets, who were his allies, to provide him with the means to protect himself. And so, like it says here, the Soviets offered offensive weapons in the form of nuclear missiles. So basically the Soviets said, hey, we'll give you a couple nukes, and if they try it again, guess what? You can use them. So the United States, we had a spy plane that revealed the existence of Soviet missiles in Cuba targeting the United States. So we had nuclear weapons off the, 90 miles off the coast of Florida, essentially, and that obviously is not a good thing. Kennedy then made a televised announcement that the United States Navy would turn back any armed ships to Cuba. So basically the Soviets were bringing missiles into Cuba, and JFK publicly announced that the United States Navy would prevent that from continuing to happen. So obviously this is going to create a very tense situation. I mean, this was literally like the verge of World War III. Kennedy orders blockade of Cuba as Reds, Soviets, build nuclear bases there. U.S. will sink Defiant armed ships, so we will attack if we need to. And this is actually a scene from a movie called 13 Days about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kind of shows you what went down here. It's not very long, 2 minutes.
Thanks, Joey.
This is how they found out about the missiles in Cuba.
Hey, Bruce. Skipper. Never mind. Just do what I do. Hand signs only. Gotcha.
Those are cameras. Getting surveillance footage.
слышит?
О, блядь, не понял.
All right, so as you saw in the video there, that footage confirmed that there were nukes in Cuba, and obviously that set alarm bells off for the U.S. And so now we find ourselves in a crisis. What are we going to do about this? And these are just some options. You know, I threw this question out there to you guys again, like what would you do if you were the president of the United States? And these were just a few of the options. So do nothing. American vulnerability to the Soviet missiles was not new. So, okay, but I guess we're just going to let it go. Diplomacy, use diplomatic pressure to get the Soviet Union to remove the missiles, meaning like negotiate, you know, maybe send a representative down there to try to talk some sense into them. Secret approach, offer Castro the choice of splitting with the Soviets or be invaded. So either you give up the missiles and, you know, kind of end your friendship with the Soviets, or we're going to come down there and go to war. Invasion was full force invasion of Cuba and the overthrow of Castro. That's very risky. People are going to die. Airstrike, use the Air Force to attack all known missile sites. You know, that's pretty self-explanatory. And then a blockade, use the Navy to block any missiles from arriving in Cuba. So these were sort of the options that were given to Kennedy by his advisors. And, you know, obviously this is a crisis, and it's a pretty dire situation. So the Cuban Missile Crisis, as it became known, nuclear war loomed over the U.S. October 16th to the 29th, 1962, as both countries prepared for war. We're eyeball to eyeball with the enemy, Secretary of State Dean Rusk would say, and the Soviets would eventually back down. The Cuban Missile Crisis was narrowly averted. Khrushchev and Kennedy sought to ease tensions between the two superpowers. In 1963, this would lead to the Limited Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which would end testing of nuclear bombs, because it's not good to test nuclear bombs. You're spewing radiation in the atmosphere and things like that. Also, there was a hotline or a direct line installed between the Soviet Union and the United States, so they could literally pick up a phone and call each other and say, hey, let's figure this out before we blow up the earth. And so, one thing that a lot of times historians don't talk about is that the United States also had missiles in Turkey. So we had our own, nukes in Turkey pointed at the Soviet Union. So we kind of did a similar thing. And at the end of the day, both sides agreed to remove those missiles. That's kind of how this whole thing, played out. So, but the bottom line is, we basically averted World War III, and nobody was seriously injured. So, like it says here, Julius Caesar, the Ides of March. So you guys read Julius Caesar, I know that, in English class. And so this kind of ties in with Kennedy, because like it says here, a government overthrow or coup, as I mentioned earlier, could this ever happen in the United States? So that's kind of what, a lot of times when people talk about the Kennedy assassination and whether or not it was a lone gunman or if there was a bigger conspiracy involved, oftentimes people will kind of bring up the fact like, well, nobody's ever going to try to overthrow the government or overthrow the president or get rid of the president. And, but these things have happened before. And the case of Julius Caesar is a good example. It was like Caesar was becoming too powerful. And again, you guys probably know more about this than me from reading the play, but, it has happened. And Julius Caesar was betrayed by his own Senate for the most part. And you guys know he got stabbed on the floor of the Senate, and he was betrayed by one of his closest allies, Et tu, Brute. And so I mentioned a minute ago that failure at the Bay of Pigs invasion resulted in tension between JFK and the CIA, and that's why some people feel like the CIA basically said, okay, Kennedy, if you don't want to cooperate with us, then we're going to get rid of you. And so this is kind of how it all played out. So to build support for the 1964 presidential election, Kennedy travels to Texas to basically campaign. On November 22nd at 12:30 in an open car motorcade, meaning he's in a convertible. I'll show you guys the photos and videos and stuff like that. President Kennedy moved throughout the streets of Dallas. Kennedy was fatally wounded and shot in the shoulder, chest, and head. Within hours, Dallas police arrested Lee Harvey Oswald. 2 days later, Jack Ruby killed Oswald. So essentially, Kennedy gets shot. Police arrest a guy that they say did it. And then 3 days later, before the investigation really went any further, this guy, Jack Ruby, jumps out of a crowd of reporters and shoots Oswald and kills him right on the spot. And so there's just a lot of really strange, odd things. And if you really start to look into this whole situation, there's some red flags that go up. Like, Oswald never admitted to shooting the president. He continually kept saying, like, I'm a patsy, or I've been set up. And he kept saying, if you get me somewhere safe, I'll talk. He kept saying that, if you get me somewhere safe, I'll talk. He was being held in the local police station, and he's saying, like, if you get me somewhere where I feel safe, I'll tell you what really happened. And then as the police were getting ready to move him to a safer location, this is when Oswald gets shot. And then what ends up happening to Jack Ruby is he gets arrested and put in jail, and then I think maybe a couple years later he dies in jail of cancer. So I don't know. There's just a lot of things there that you're kind of like, I'm not so sure about this. But after the assassination, President Johnson would create the Warren Commission, headed by this guy, Chief Justice Earl Warren. That's why it's called the Warren Commission. And, they basically were tasked with investigating the assassination and determining an official finding as to what happened. So, obviously then Vice President Johnson's going to assume the presidency. So this is Kennedy before he's shot, obviously. Here's Lee Harvey Oswald mugshot. That's Lee Harvey Oswald when he was in the Marines. He was in the Marines, but he was not a sniper. He was not a sharpshooter. This famous picture of him holding the weapon. Even this has been scrutinized. I've seen videos that say it's fake. It was photoshopped. Or another theory is that they did this intentionally so that they could say, look, he's holding the murder weapon. Obviously, he did it. So, again, Oswald himself was a pretty unique guy. He was a communist sympathizer. He had traveled to the Soviet Union. He had ties with Cuba. That's the murder weapon. This is where he was at, up in a school book depository. This is where the shots were fired. So he's up here. This is where the car was. And, like I said, he continually said, I'm just a patsy. A patsy's a person who's being blamed for something they didn't do, basically. So he's talking to report. This was he hadn't even lawyered up yet. He's talking to the press they arrest him and they're asking him all kinds of questions. Did you shoot the president? And he says no. This would never happen today. The president would never be riding around in a car, a convertible with the top down. They would never let the suspected murderer just talk to the press openly. It's a different time. We're talking 1960s here. So, 64. So we're talking about a different era. But prior to this, Kennedy was quoted as saying, I will splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it in the wind. So after the Bay of Pigs, Kennedy basically said he was going to eliminate the CIA. I'm going to get rid of the CIA. And that's where a lot of these conspiracies come from, is that, Kennedy says he's going to eliminate the CIA. Well, guess what? They're not going to allow that to happen. The CIA had already committed these types of assassinations in other countries. A lot of people think they did it here. And then this is a still photo of the shooting. So that's Jack Ruby. He jumped out of the crowd. He was kind of hiding. Jumps out of the crowd with a pistol. This guy here obviously doesn't want to get shot. He doesn't know what's going on. He shoots him point blank. A couple minutes later, he bleeds out. And there's actually video of that on YouTube. Whoops. So this is a famous picture of LBJ being sworn in on Air Force One. So they're on an airplane here, Air Force One, right? That's the plane the president flies on. It's very crowded, obviously. This is Mrs. Kennedy. They put her coat on because she's covered in blood. She had brain matter on her. She literally was holding her husband's head in her lap as he's, and his brain was literally hanging out of his head. And so she's traumatized. And they did this as a display of, I guess, the passing of the torch to Johnson. But a few years ago, actually, a student pointed this out to me, that there's this video, or this picture is actually very suspect, and I'll show you what I mean here in a second. So LBJ is being sworn in, and this is his buddy back here watching. I believe he was a senator. I would have to double check on that. But in the next photo, there's something that they never show. Never seen this in any books or anything. And like I said, this is out there if you Google it, but a student actually showed me this. Yeah, I don't know. Again, looks like this guy's winking at his buddy, and it looks like LBJ's smiling at him as if to say, we pulled it off. We did it. So again, I don't know. Incriminating? I don't know. Maybe just a couple buddies sharing a glance. But JFK was not pronounced dead until he was at the hospital because, again, I think I mentioned this to you guys with Saving Private Ryan. According to the Catholic faith, you cannot get into heaven until you've been read your last rites by a priest. And so they didn't declare him dead until he was at the hospital, because then a priest came in and read him his last rites. He was probably dead before that. That's the eternal flame in Washington, D.C. that was basically built to, in honor of JFK. It never goes off, never turns off. Flame never goes out. And this is a Zapruder film. The Zapruder film is the actual video of JFK being assassinated. And this is actually referring to the magic bullet theory, which is something that the Warren Commission came up with. That basically the bullet would have had to make like a Z in order to hit, because the guy in front of Kennedy got hit too. And so they called it the magic bullet, because it would have had to have been magic to be able to do what it did. But I'm just going to keep going here. This is actually a popular, I got this in an email one time, and it's just kind of a popular list of coincidences between Lincoln and Kennedy. So, you can see here, both were concerned with civil rights. Lincoln was elected president in 1860. Kennedy was elected in 1960. Both were slain on a Friday and in the presence of their wives. Both were shot from behind and in the head. Their successors, both named Johnson, were Southern Democrats, and both were in the Senate. Andrew Johnson was born in 1808. Lyndon Johnson was born in 1908. John Wilkes Booth, who killed Lincoln, was born in 1839, and Lee Harvey Oswald was born in 1939. Booth and Oswald were Southerners, favoring unpopular ideas. Both presidents' wives lost children through death while in the White House. Lincoln's secretary, whose name was Kennedy, advised him not to go to the theater, and Kennedy's secretary, who was named Lincoln, advised him not to go to Dallas. John Wilkes Booth shot Lincoln in a theater and ran to a warehouse. Lee Harvey Oswald shot Kennedy from a warehouse and ran to a theater. That's where they arrested him. The names Lincoln and Kennedy each contain 7 letters. The names Andrew Johnson and Lyndon Johnson each contain 13 letters. The names John Wilkes Booth and Lee Harvey Oswald each contain 15 letters. Both assassins were killed before being brought to trial, and both Johnsons were opposed for re-election by men whose names start with G. So just some weird coincidences there. There's also a lot of people that were associated with the assassination, like witnesses and just people who are around it, and a lot of them died mysteriously. This is just a link showing you, but it's like, the brakes in their car failed and all kinds of weird stuff like that. And this was a video of a Green Beret whistleblower who said that he overheard instructors who were basically teaching them how to commit an assassination, and he overheard them like saying how they pulled the perfect assassination off with JFK or something like that. Obviously, there's a ton of stuff out there. These are all just links to all this stuff, but maybe we'll take a closer look at that a little bit later. President Johnson and the Great Society. So again, like I said, he named his presidency the Great Society. Johnson was born in Texas, and he was raised in poverty. He had no money. This is him serving in the Navy. Here he is with JFK, but again, they didn't really like each other. They weren't friends, like I said. There he is on his ranch in Texas. And Johnson was kind of seen as like a hillbilly. The press kind of made fun of him. The press loved Kennedy. They didn't necessarily love Johnson. So here he is with his dogs. Really liked his hunting dogs. He had a car that he would play a joke on people. He would drive them around, and then he would drive into the water, and they thought he was trying to kill them, and then they realized that he actually had a car that could drive in water. So I don't know. That's pretty cool. There he is yelling at somebody. He was known as for having a really bad temper. He was kind of he had a reputation for being quite a jerk, actually. And so I'm just going to keep going here. But he basically, he called his plan for his presidency the Great Society. And a lot of people, if you look at this cartoon here, this looks like the French flag. And the reason for that is because France is a socialist country. And a lot of people think that Johnson was trying to take the United States into becoming a socialist country. Socialism is similar to communism, where the government kind of owns and runs almost everything. It's not quite as extreme as communism, but it's a close second. So Johnson takes over, establishing continuity. He was a master of compromise. Johnson had many years of experience in Washington, serving in Congress as the Senate Majority Leader. Johnson's focused on the Kennedy agenda of continuing tax cuts and civil rights legislation. Civil rights legislation was extremely important to Johnson. They called this the Johnson treatment because Johnson was pretty tall. I think he was 6'3", and he would sort of tower over people and like get in their face to kind of sort of bully them, to get them to agree with him. And that was called the Johnson treatment. So he used to do that. And again, the press kind of made fun of Johnson. This was a picture of him when he got his gallbladder taken out. He kind of pulled up his shirt, and, people just kind of made fun of him for being, kind of like a country hillbilly. But this is a political cartoon making fun of that. And that's actually that's in the shape of Vietnam. So they said it's kind of making fun of Johnson because he really got stuck on Vietnam. Vietnam basically led to his downfall. And we'll talk a lot about that later as we get to Vietnam, because that's going to be its own unit, but just kind of keep that in the back of your mind for now. And so the war on poverty, Johnson described his vision as an unconditional war on poverty. The Office of Economic Opportunity allocated $1 billion to creating the Job Corps, which was a work training program for people 16 to 21. Also, the Head Start, or preschool education program, was started under Johnson. This is when essentially kindergarten was started. I know you guys probably think kindergarten's been around as long as schools have been around, but my dad didn't go to kindergarten. He just went to first grade. By the time I came around, I went to kindergarten, but it was created under the Johnson administration. The Volunteers in Service to America was a domestic Peace Corps, so similar to the Peace Corps, but rather than working around the world, they worked here in the U.S. So Sesame Street was a part of Johnson's social programs that was created to try and help educate kids. Johnson, again, his two primary goals as president were promoting civil rights and ending poverty. And so he would go down to places like Appalachia, like West Virginia, where people were living in extreme poverty, like here, where they didn't have running water. And he was just trying to find ways to help these people because, again, Johnson grew up in poverty, so it was something that was like personal for him. But again, people were living down there in like these shacks and, like I said, didn't have running water. Look, this place is like falling down. So look at these clothes. They're just, people had no money. All dirty. It's pretty sad. But he went down there personally, which I'm always surprised when I see these pictures that he was down there like personally visiting these people and talking to them. So the Great Society, Johnson had little trouble pushing legislation through Congress. Johnson had his own agenda for the Great Society. And again, like I mentioned a second ago, his two primary goals were ending poverty and ending racial injustice. Those were, the two things that he really wanted to focus on as president. But unfortunately for him, he's going to inherit a situation in Southeast Asia called Vietnam. And that Vietnam War is going to consume his presidency. It's really going to be what kind of, he wants to focus on things here and kind of, again, focus on poverty and promoting civil rights, but he's going to be dealing with this Vietnam problem his whole presidency. So there he is talking to MLK and other civil rights leaders. And like it says here, a question I threw out, can you think of 3 words that would describe your idea of a great society? So again, I don't know, something to consider. What would a great society look like in your eyes? So Johnson and Congress, the programs that were created under the Johnson administration, Medicare, which was a national health insurance program for people over 65, that's still in place. Medicaid, which is a national health insurance for people that couldn't afford health insurance. I believe this was replaced by Obamacare. So when President Obama came into office, I believe he implemented kind of like a better program. And so I think this was sort of, like I said, displaced by that. Elementary and Secondary Education Act allocated $1.3 billion in aid to schools in poor communities. The Omnibus Housing program, which was headed by Robert Weaver, was the first African American to serve in the president's cabinet. Billions of dollars were allocated on urban renewal and housing assistance. Political cartoons there. The quality of life. So, Corporation for Public Broadcasting, also known as PBS, was a nonprofit organization offering educational television. Obviously, that was where Sesame Street was on for a long time. I think they moved it to HBO or something like that. But Rachel Carson and environmentalism. She wrote a book called Silent Spring about the importance of the environment. So this is when you start to see a lot of attention being given to taking care of the environment. And I think this book, I can't remember, I never read it, but I believe it was about how if we don't start to try to take care of the earth and the environment, then it's going to get really bad, basically, is what that book said. The Warren Court decisions. So during this time, Chief Justice Earl Warren defined and extended individual rights, protecting the rights of the accused. And a lot of Supreme Court legislation was passed under this administration. So Gideon versus Wainwright was when it was basically declared that the court must provide an attorney. Miranda versus Arizona, Miranda rights must be read before being arrested. And a lot of times you'll see this in movies. Again, like I said, when you get arrested, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used in a court of law, those types of things. They have to tell you, they have to inform you of your rights when you get arrested, basically. So the decline of the Great Society. So foreign policy, Johnson intervened in the Dominican Republic, sending 22,000 Marines to help stabilize the situation and stop the spread of communism. In the spring of 1965, Johnson's focus shifted to Vietnam. And like it says here, the Great Society was shot down on the battlefields of Vietnam. And that was MLK that said that, because the government would then start to spend money on fighting this war instead of fighting poverty here in the U.S. So, again, I mean, this is a topic we still talk about, and I mentioned this when I was talking about the Ukraine, which is like, should we be taking all of our money and spending it on ourselves and trying to fix our own country, or should we be sending it overseas to help fight wars and things like that? So, but Vietnam sort of started under Kennedy, but it was just there was a skirmish going on there, and Kennedy had some advisors there, but it was never a full-fledged war under Kennedy. And a lot of historians think that if Kennedy would have lived, he would have never gotten involved in Vietnam like we eventually would. But under Johnson, Johnson didn't quite know how to fight that war, so he just threw a ton of troops at it and thought that eventually we would just win, but it just didn't happen that way. And, I won't go into that anymore because we'll get to Vietnam when we get to it. But essentially, Vietnam is what really brought down Johnson as a president, and just really kind of did away with a lot of things he was trying to do here in the U.S. because all of our attention and money and focus went to Vietnam. And so that would consume our nation for about a decade, unfortunately, and we lost a lot of soldiers there too. So we'll talk more about that later. Domestic opposition. Republicans started gaining seats in Congress and prevented any further legislation of being passed. So Johnson wasn't able to get his programs passed. Despite opposition, the Great Society programs continue to benefit Americans today. So we do still see some of these remnants of the programs that I had mentioned a minute ago. So here's your study guide. As usual, make your cheat sheet for your quiz, and all this stuff will be on the quiz.